Panasonic. If I were to classify Panasonic as a camera brand, I would call them the most filmmaker friendly. And as the most filmmaker friendly brand, they have made the most filmmaker friendly hybrid mirrorless camera with the S5 IIX. And can it really compete with the Sony heavy hitters like the A7 IV, A7S III, and FX3? I mean, have Lumix finally leveled the playing field? Well, I own all of these cameras, and after some serious testing, I was seriously surprised by what this camera can do. Now, I bought the original Panasonic S5 back in 2022. I love the size, I love the features, I love the look and colors. I used it as my vlogging camera on a trip to Amsterdam where you can see it in action. Feel free to check it out. Nobody did at the time. I enjoyed the original S5 so much that I started to rig out the camera. I started to invest in lenses. I used it on a couple of my corporate jobs. I was becoming a panny pal. This was going to be my new system. And then I bought an A7 IV and dropped that Panasonic S5 like a bad habit.
Tag team specialist.
See, one without the other isn't any good. Oh, I knew he was going to do that.
See, I loved everything about the Panasonic S5, except one thing, the autofocus. Now, the autofocus was an absolute disaster. And after using the A7 IV, it wasn't about features or image quality, it was simply about ease of use. Why am I battling with my camera when this other camera puts up no resistance? It just lets me film. And so my little expedition into Panasonic land ended after only a few short months. That is until recently when I decided to get the Panasonic S5 IIX more out of curiosity to act as a C cam for some of my regular mobile podcast work. But my C cam quickly graduated to my B cam, and now I'm even considering making it my A cam. In the same way that the A7 IV killed the S5, the S5 IIX is kinda killing my Sony cameras. Panasonic are on some Return of the Jedi shit right now, and I'm here for it. So the million-dollar question, how good is Panasonic's new phase detect autofocus? And the short answer is, good enough. The long answer is, it's still not as good as Sony's or Canon's, but the gap has gotten so much closer that you can, especially after the latest firmware update, use it how you would use those other cameras with very little drama. The camera's autofocus is no longer putting up such a fight. Most of the time, it just works. And here's the thing, you might not need the autofocus to be as good as the Sony as long as the S5 IIX does other things better. And it does a lot of things much better. And because it is the most filmmaker-friendly camera, the features it has make it a really compelling proposition for me, the savage filmmaker.
Oh, okay, I see what you did there.
To ditch Sony and become a panny pal once again. So, will you be my panny pal? First, let's cut right down to brass tacks. When I took this camera out for testing, I was immediately impressed by the image, because I am used to the S-Log3 Sony image, and the S-Log3 Sony image is not that good. Now, I don't mean you can't make it look good. I mean that the log profile has very little latitude. Underexpose it, and raising the levels makes it look ugly. Overexpose it, you lose the highlights too quickly. Got light and dark patches in your image? Good luck balancing them. It's just a very limited log profile. Sony has other strengths, but the S-Log3 and the A7S III and A7 IV is not one of them. It says it has 15 stops of dynamic range, but for me in real world use, it feels like it has the least amount of dynamic range of any modern camera due to S-Log3 itself being so limited. Now, as soon as I filmed with the S5 IIX and brought it into DaVinci Resolve to play around with, I was instantly reminded of what a proper log profile should be able to do, which is to give you latitude to push and pull your image. It should provide you flexibility. It should protect your image from hitting either ends of its spectrum too easily. And Panasonic's V-Log does this much better than Sony's S-Log, at least in my experience. This was a very noticeable difference. I would just call Vlog thick with 2 C's, whereas there's definitely no junk in Sony's trunk, if you catch my drift. So my ability to grade the vlog image was immediately very appealing to me as someone suffocated by straight rations of S-Log3 for the past 2 years. Then, of course, there's all the different shooting formats. Shoot in UHD, shoot in Cinema 4K, shoot in 6K open gate. All of these options that my Sonys don't give me. And of course, shutter angle and things that Sony are now only barely providing flaccid updates around their cinema camera line with many years after their initial release. On the S5 IIX, they are available right out of the box. I mean, there's levels to this shit.
There's levels to this! There's levels! Take a shot! What's up? Oh! Big run! Anderson's down!
Have you tried upgrading your A7S III firmware to get true Cinema 4K and 24p? It's an insanely overcomplicated process that forces you to register a creator account to download half of the update. It's just such a chore for a feature that is so long overdue, it's hard for me to get on board. I would also say that while both of these cameras no doubt have a digital look to them, the S5 IIX feels a little more organic, a little closer to the Blackmagic cameras in terms of how they render their image, and that is something that I award points for because I'm going to make a whole video about Sony cameras really having a hard time looking natural. Then you have the anamorphic modes on the S5 IIX, which are really excellent. In fact, they lead the camera market in this department, and as someone who loves him some anamorphic action, sticking it on this camera is really cool. The Sony cameras have all sorts of awkward crops involved when using anamorphic lenses that a lot of times feel like more trouble than they're worth. The S5 IIX can record up to 4 audio tracks and take line level audio input to the camera. Again, it just seems like they were doing their best to accommodate filmmakers and what would be useful to filmmakers. So for recording straight into camera, the S5 audio options also has the advantage. Then there's the image stabilization, which again is some of the best IBIS of any mirrorless camera. They also have dual base ISOs at 640 and 4000. And I have to say that while the camera is not A7S III good in low light, it is probably the second best hybrid camera for low light filming, at least that I've used. Then there's the external RAW recording. Now, I have touched on this in some other videos about the S5 IIX, but this is one of the few cameras to offer 5.9K B-RAW and ProRes RAW externally. Now, as someone who loves B-RAW and edits in Resolve, I think this is the perfect option for people who want the next level of image quality but don't want to use something like the Blackmagic 6K. This is a trick the Sonys can't do as they only feature ProRes RAW for external recording. But the features don't end there, because you can record regular ProRes 422 and below through the USB-C output on the camera. Again, perfect for fast turnaround stuff where you just want to supply a universal, easy to edit, very high quality codec. The camera also has long op and all-eye recording options to the internal SD card. So in terms of the most flexibility, in terms of codec and quality variety, the S5 IIX is really unparalleled. I just love all the options here. No regular ProRes options with the Sonys, no B-RAW, no 6K open gate, to name just a few differences. You can also import and load your own LUTs onto the camera, an excellent feature that is super helpful when trying to judge your image. These can be added for monitoring, or you can burn them onto your clips for fast turnaround work. The S5 IIX has got 2 little vents at the top, which means that it's also never going to overheat, or at least it would take some pretty crazy circumstances for it to ever get that hot. The flip-out LCD screen seems to be of a higher quality than both of my Sonys, and the body itself just feels a little more premium on the S5 IIX. The buttons, the finish, etc., it all just feels a little more solid. Now, we should talk about frame rates because the first thing I always hear is there's no 120 frames per second in 4K. Like people would rather die than own a camera that can't perform this trick. And what about the fact that you have to crop into ASPC mode to shoot at 60 frames per second? How embarrassing. I mean, is this even a real camera, bro? Look, in my opinion, super slow motion is a gimmick. It is nice to have. Absolutely. Is it really necessary? Absolutely not. I almost never use 120 frames per second on my A7S III. I do definitely use 60 frames per second, but I also don't care about the crop because when I'm filming slow motion, I'm generally filming detail shots, which actually require me to get closer anyway. So quite frequently, I find that this crop the S5 IIX has is actually pretty helpful. Also, can we talk about price for a second? Because I don't know about you, but value for money is actually pretty important to me. And considering the amount of features this has and the quality of the image it produces, this probably represents the best value for money of any mirrorless camera. And it's not even close. The S5 IIX is frequently on special, and normally you can get it for around $2,000. And you can get it secondhand for $1,500. Now compare that to an A7S III at $3,500 new, $1,500 more, and then the Sony FX3, which is essentially the same camera as the A7S III and a different body, for $3,900, almost twice the price of the S5 IIX, while having half as many actual cinema camera features and shooting options. I know people like to compare the S5 IIX to the A7 IV because of their similar price points, but really, this camera is more comparable to those Sony FX cameras and is better in many ways. So where does the Sonys actually win? Well, when we're talking about low light, there is nothing better than the FX3, A7S III, and the S5 IIX 4000 base ISO is still pretty far away from the 128,000 base ISO of the Sonys. Autofocus is obviously a win for Sony. Also, the E-mount lens system at this point has many more lens options and many more affordable lens options than the L-mount Alliance has currently. And if we're talking about photography, the A7 IV is definitely a better photography camera than the S5 IIX. Plus, there's the better slow motion options. And one feature that the FX3 and A7S III have, which I think is worth highlighting, is being able to use the XLR top handle and fit it to the hot shoe. Now, I have a lot of issues with the design of this top handle. It's awkward, the handle is too short, it messes up the balance of your camera rig, and it is quite poorly designed. But with a few modifications, it's an essential part of my kit as I can record high quality audio straight into my camera on 2 channels with phantom power. The Panasonic also has a hot shoe XLR adapter, but it's not a handle. And because it's not built into a handle, it really gets in the way and is not at all convenient to use. The new version for the GH7 doesn't look any better, and I do think if I could change one thing about the S5 IIX, it would be for Lumix to make a version of this XLR adapter that is built into a top handle like the Sony one. It just makes things so much easier for audio recording and cinema rigging. Now, if none of those things really matter to you, the S5 IIX is really going to provide you a better filmmaking experience with a nicer, richer codec and some killer features like anamorphic support and 6K open gate, plus that beautiful external B-roll recording. But no camera is perfect, and the S5 IIX has some problems of its own worth highlighting before we bring this plane down to land. Firstly, IBIS. Yeah, it's great, until it's not great. I mean, take a look at this tracking shot with IBIS on the 24-70 at around 24. It seems very smooth until you look at the edges of frame where it is doing something seriously wacky in the corners with its corrections. Also, the IBIS has what I call the Panasonic stick, where as you start to move the camera to pan or change position, the IBIS kind of sticks for a second as if it's fighting against your camera movement and kind of gets stuck for half a frame before beginning to follow what you're doing. So the IBIS isn't always a good thing, as it does overcompensate sometimes. And we all know about trying to overcompensate. Then there's the menus. Look, I hate the Sony menu system as much as the next human being on earth, but this Panasonic menu system is, and I can't believe I'm going to say this, equally as bad. There are just so many options that it is very overwhelming, and it will take you hours of scrolling to settle on your optimum settings. And then if you want to change something quickly, you might be searching for 15 minutes just to tweak a setting. Lots of features are good, but they need to figure a way to simplify navigating them, because at the moment, it's a nightmare. The 6K modes and OpenGate are amazing, but you can only record in 420 color space, not 422 like most of the other modes. Now, this is not ideal if you take your grading really seriously. Don't get me wrong, all the image options are really pretty good, and it's very difficult to tell the difference between them, but it would be better if you had access to the same 422 color in all of the different resolution modes. Then there's the infamous rolling shutter. For me, this rolling shutter is about equal to the A7 IV. The FX cameras and the A7S III are much better in this respect, where their rolling shutter is almost unnoticeable, but in certain situations, this S5 IIX is definitely not going to hold up. When you are externally recording a RAW signal, or you record to ProRes over USB-C, you can't record internally at the same time. And this is one of the great features of the FX line of cameras, is you can do both. This is definitely a feature that's sorely missing here. There's no backup or redundancy if your external recording were to fail when you're in these modes. And this camera also does not have a OLPF filter, so you may get weird moire and artifacting in certain scenarios. I'm yet to really experience this, but I'm sure it will happen. And look, this is a chonky boy, okay? There's no denying if you're used to the S5 and you go up to the S5 IIX, you'll find they're in very different weight classes, and the Sony cameras are definitely more compact and lighter. So, do I think the S5 IIX is better than my Sony cameras? If we're talking about image quality, codecs, and features that matter to me, yes. If we're talking about just ease of use, going to work with the minimal amount of effort, the Sonys have things that make for a more efficient shooting experience. I'm torn. I'm on the fence. On the one hand, I much prefer the image I get from the S5 IIX. I much prefer the shooting options too. But the crazy autofocus and low light modes and the XLR top handle make the Sony cameras a difficult addiction to just quit cold turkey. I mean, let's put it this way. The S5 IIX wins for anything where I value image over audio and autofocus options. This will be my camera. For creative and narrative work, the S5 IIX again is my preference. But for day-to-day corporate grind, Sony is the plain vanilla that keeps on being the reliable, safe option, rather than risk disaster on a bowl full of freaky cappuccino flavor you thought would be a good idea until you try the first scoop. But look, if you're someone with a modest budget who wants the best options for filmmaking and video content for the best price, the S5 IIX is indeed pure sex. And if I was starting again, this camera plus 2 or 3 lenses seems like a much better choice than, say, a Sony FX3 and nothing else. The value here is just too sweet. And if you've ever been someone who's loved the Blackmagic cameras and image like me, but said to yourself, I just wish it had autofocus. I wish it was a bit smaller. I want a Blackmagic hybrid style camera. Well, the S5 IIX is probably the closest you're ever going to come to that. If you want to see how I rig out the Panasonic S5 IIX to solve some of its issues and make it a true cinema camera, click on the link beside me. And if you've found this video helpful in making your decision on whether the S5 IIX is right for you, please consider liking and subscribing, and also hitting that notification bell. The YouTube algorithm is a cold and desolate wasteland, where the people you subscribe to are merely anonymous ghouls shuffling haphazardly past your feed. Only the notification bell can provide enough anti-rads to revive these poor creatures back to human form so they can once again provide you with locations to your next vault. As always, I am the Savage Filmmaker, and I'll see you when I see you.